I'm Zwanile Ngubeni and you're watching Joburg Today.
The local government elections have just happened and citizens across the country have decided that they're not very happy with any one particular party, and so coalitions seem to be the order of the day. How can an organisation that promotes good governance and functioning cities like SACities Network help these cities in this new era of politics? I spoke to their CEO, Sithole Mbanga. I'm Peter Ndoro, and this is For the Record. SACities, 2002 is when you were formed. What was your vision then? How has it changed over time, especially given the pressures of modern living and modern urban planning and challenges?
Maybe let's start answering that question by reflecting on the need. In 2002, you had a local government system that was new, democratic local government. You had new mayors for the first time under that democratic dispensation. They needed to exchange knowledge and information amongst themselves in order to talk to the efficacy of the policies with which they were asked to govern municipalities. Whether it was about how do you increase rates, how do you change a set of traffic lights, why do you change them, how do you drive development, or whatever the subject matter under the sun. So the need was centered around 5 key pillars of knowledge need. And in no particular order, they range from how do you drive the economy of a city, which is what in our lexicon in the cities network we call the productive city. Secondly, how do you, coming out of a deliberately divided apartheid city, planned as such, how do you break those barriers and make your cities more inclusive so that you're able to create inclusivity or frameworks of inclusivity for both rich and poor, for young and old, for black and white, right? Thirdly, how do you deal with governability, right? Which means accountability, which means citizens feeling led and not feeling in the dark, having a sense of understanding where their futures lie and what that future would look like. Fourthly, sustainability and resilience of the city, which is not only limited to the green agenda as we know it today, of looking after nature, of ensuring that our natural resources are preserved for future generations, whether it's water, whether it's land, but also the institutional sustainability. Is it finances? Is it the human capacity and the likes? And the last pillar was knowledge around how do we think futuristically about the city. Cities of tomorrow, how would we have, as you made mention, strategized for them? How would we have planned for them and ensure that those plans do become a reality? So it was the need by the first cohort of city leaders. I prefer to call them the city fathers and the city mothers of democratic local government, yeah.
It's almost 2 decades later now.
Indeed.
Our world has changed significantly. Climate change wasn't a big thing back then. It is a critical thing now. How have you adapted over time? And I say this because populations have doubled in many cities, and that's put a strain. People complain about service delivery, the greening of our cities, so many issues on the table. How have you, as SACities Network, been able to adapt so that you can continue to deliver?
On the main, the understanding is that human beings are anthropological beings, right? They will always move towards greener pastures. They'll never stay as they were made to stay during the apartheid era in homelands where opportunity was not there, where it was barren. So once the country opened up, automatically South Africa's urbanization rate was going to rise, as it has happened in the last 2 decades. Suddenly, rural areas are being left empty. People are migrating towards the city. In fact, one of the things that has opened up as a result of migration is that not only are metropolitan municipalities bigger, in fact, there's a bigger growth in your intermediary cities that are not necessarily metropolitan municipalities. So that has happened in the last 2 decades. The white paper on local government was very clear on what the role of those municipalities will be, which is to provide services in the context of urbanization. But I think the one thing that nobody thought of is the issue that you have made reference to. So new municipalities in the year 2000. But in 2007, 2008, there's a global financial meltdown, right? Which means the very foundation of institutional sustainability upon which they were established gets challenged. They no longer have sufficient financial resources to speak of, which in today's speak, we say it's one of the waves that have attacked municipalities. And then secondly, the climate change, the impact of climate change on municipalities. Water, for instance, water scarcity in places such as Cape Town, in places such as Gqeberha, Buffalo City, the eastern seaboard of the country suddenly becoming drier and drier, and water scarcities. Whereas in some northern parts, such as the Gauteng city region, there's floods, right? And that suddenly meant that the infrastructure upon which these cities was built is under tremendous pressure. And that happens at a time when there is not sufficient money to maintain that same infrastructure, which is supposed to be hosting a growing population. So it becomes a complexity. And today, 2020, we're talking about a health emergency called COVID. So there's been, in the 20 years, there's been 15 years of waves of challenges that has been exerted on these municipalities, not least corruption, the inability to be accountable, the inability to lead these communities. And the changes that have been there relative to the challenges, I think it's difficult to say they have been commensurate to the challenges. They remain there nonetheless. But I think at the bare minimum, one can commend the fact that there has been transformation. It's not been sufficient. There's been institutional changes, wholesale. Remember in 2002, or even just before that, there were close to 2,000 municipalities. Now they have been rationalized. We're talking about 287 municipalities. We have tiers within the context of spheres of government. So all those institutional changes, I think one will look back one day and say, actually, there was a lot of, we've moved quite far. But I think we're struggling with achieving the outcomes. That's what we're struggling with, in the context of the things that I have made mention.
Yeah. And we haven't even talked about energy, but that's probably another whole conversation. On your mission statements, one of the things that you talk about is promoting good governance. And I think you've given us a clue already. As citizens, we see the Auditor General's reports and we see that governance has been a challenge over time. Does that mean you as SACities Network hasn't been winning?
No, I don't think it means we have not been winning. Actually, I think we have been winning. The fact that the Auditor General is able to make pronouncements on issues or indicators that the Auditor General utilizes to measure good governance is indication that it's not indicators that were conceptualized, amongst others, by people that are in the Cities Network and have been shelved. They've actually been put into use. I think there are certain things that unfortunately have become a misnomer. The notion of a clean audit. I think we know that it's something that doesn't exist. A clean audit assumes that all factors remain the same. I give you 10 rands as a mayor, and I expect you to deliver water with that 10 rands, and everything else remains the same. And therefore, you will be able to deliver on what the citizens have asked you to do under similar or unchanging circumstances. And I've already given you a plethora of things that have meant change.
But we can compare cities to cities.
For sure.
And some perform better than others, and there must be a reason for that.
Some perform better than others because of their style of governance. Some tend to prioritize a particular set of the population within the city that is able to provide and pay, to afford for those services, whether it's rates, water, taxes. Others tend to do the opposite and say, let the tax base or the revenue base of the municipality be shared across and spread across those that can afford and those that are unable to afford. In other words, then you then end up cross-subsidizing for those that are unable to afford. That then means that you become thin in your resources, and the difference you can then see where it has made impact, whether positive or negative or positive.
How have you been able to deal with this growing, ever-growing network of informal settlements that are being built around cities?
I think cities are not coping, and it's not just a South African phenomena. It's a function of in-migration towards cities against the inability to keep pace with informal or with demands for settlements. Broadly speaking, practitioners tend to refer to that as informality, whether it's informality in the form of human settlements or it's informality in the form of the economy, because you also get in the economic stream people that live as a result of their utilizing their trade informally, selling their services to whoever it is that has that particular demand. It's a very difficult thing to do because it assumes a certain level of basics are there. So if there's going to be informal settlements, the assumption is that there's land. If there's no land, people will settle informally, and they will occupy.
All right, there's a couple of more things that I'd like us to talk about. One, perhaps, that's very intriguing now, and that's the politics of the cities. For the first time, we're seeing a record number of hung municipalities, major cities that are going to be in coalitions. How do you navigate this? Because it was only new in the last election cycle, so a lot of learning is still happening, I guess.
So which means we've now entered a new phase, which means there's going to be new lessons on the governance models that we have. Peter, my interpretation of what the elections results have given us as a country is, I think society is calling for cooperation. I think society has said, we want you as the political parties to cooperate on how you govern us. However, I think it's quite unfortunate that political parties have preferred the language of coalitions rather than governments of cooperation, right? And I think conceptually then, if you move from the premise that we're in a coalition, which for me is short-termism, right, rather than the long-term that society is calling for, clearly, I think we're going to be in trouble. I'm not a futurist, but I just think that conceptually, when we move from a premise that we must be in coalition rather than in governments of cooperation, there is going to be a problem.
So the language needs to change.
The concept needs to change. The language needs, the foundation of these new municipal governments, for me, is going to have to change if we are to meet what society demands of us.
All right, and perhaps finally, looking further afield, yes, you're an SACities network, but I guess there are lessons to be learned from further afield, abroad, and maybe even Africa, because we are similar in many ways with our brothers and sisters across the continent.
No, indeed. If you look globally, local governments meet under the auspices of an entity called the United Cities and Local Governments, UCLGE. And this is where a lot of lessons is being shared around governing in an emergency. We're all gripped by the COVID pandemic. So how do you govern? So there's lessons that are coming out of there on how these municipalities have started to transform and change their own institutions in order to respond to emergency governance. In the African continent, I think the issues of informality is a big thing to learn from. There are countries that are beginning to cope and are finding coping mechanisms on how to deal with informality and the challenges of human settlements. There is. Similarly, we are also sharing with our counterparts in the African continent how South Africa has gone through this transformation and what lessons it has learned.